I get out of my truck and I come over, and everybody, there's probably about a dozen, maybe fewer people, all guys I know from Delta Flight, or guys coming in on my shift, or people that work in the staff. And they all start to tell me all at once that they had this real world UFO encounter at 08:45 that morning. And the short story was that there were 3 Boeing contractors working on Launch Facility 21 and 10, 2 launch pads on the north end of the base. And they were doing maintenance on the National Missile Defense Project. This was one of the sites with the interceptors. And they had called in and said there was a gigantic red floating square at low altitude over the launch pad making no noise.
Welcome back. I'm here today with Jeff Nuccetelli. Jeff, welcome, my friend.
Good morning. Welcome. Great to be here.
I'm telling you, you're a brave man telling this story, because just before this, we started recording, we were talking about the inanity of the refusal of the U.S. government to just, rather than admit that, hey, these are UAPs flying over nuclear materials effectively. They're trying to insinuate that the Russians or someone else are flying conventional drones over U.S. nuclear assets. And we're just like, well, we don't want to like upset the apple cart or, fire stuff into the, when there's a civilian population around, and like a litany of other excuses, and just how like you don't let anything fly over nuclear assets.
Right.
Period. The only reason you do it is you don't have the technological means to shoot it down. Full stop. Anyway, we'll get into some of that later, but it's hilarious watching the Mirage men just flail at this.
Yeah.
So, okay. So let's start with some of your background. What years kind of were you in the Air Force, and what was your specialty? And then what led you to an assignment at Vandenberg Air Force Base?
Yeah, so I joined right out of high school, less than a year out of high school, joined the Air Force. I got a guaranteed job to be a military policeman. Back in those days in 93, the career field was broken up into different careers. So we had a law enforcement specialty, a security specialty, and our K-9 handlers, combat arms. So I went in guaranteed security. So my first bit of training when I went in was security based. We got a little bit of law enforcement training, but it was protecting nuclear assets, aircraft, ground combat, skills to defend the base, and just general security. So yeah, I joined in 93, went to basic, went to technical school, the police academy at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, graduated from the police academy. Then I went to machine gun school. I was a 60 gunner early on, and then went up to Fort Dix, New Jersey for ground combat training. And that was run by the U.S. Army. It was like a basic infantry tactics, ground combat level 1 training. And then I finished all that up, and my first assignment was in Japan. Pretty happy about that. I'd always wanted to travel. And
where in Japan was that? Like Okinawa, or is that
Yokohama? No, I was in the very northern prefecture in Japan. It's called Aomori. It means the Blue Mountains. It's just beautiful, very northern part of Honshu, the main island. And
is that where the Ainu are?
The Ainu, the indigenous people are from that region.
So many questions. Yeah, they're like white people, kind of.
Yeah, they had some, I guess, Caucasian features.
Yeah.
Yeah. And extremely ancient culture. When I was over there, we actually were doing an exercise on Misawa Air Base, and we were digging fighting positions, and we dug into an Ainu site, I think from the Jomon period. So the site was like over 12,000 years old.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Bain Books at bain.com.
So we dug into pottery shards and some sculptures, and we stopped and they brought in a team of archaeologists and they excavated the site. So I got to handle some of those objects. So
sorry, I don't mean to take it off in this direction, but it's fascinating because I know the Japanese are not super thrilled that there's a culture on their island that's older than their own. So what was the team that came? Was it a Japanese team or was it an American?
It was a Japanese team. They had coordinated with the federal employees on base with the Japanese nationals to come in and excavate. But yeah, that region, Japan was, I guess, colonized is the right word, from south to north. So they moved from the southern into the northern regions. And as they conquered territory and expanded, they would build these castle towns. So Misawa was right near Hachinohe, which is the 8th gate. They had different gates that led into the northern wilderness. And so I was up in the very northern part. And yeah, a lot of ancient legends in that region. There's all kind of like spookiness in that area. There's a place called Osolezon, which is one of the, I think there's 7 haunted mountains in Japan. So that's in that region. I got to visit there. So yeah, it was really cool, living there. There's shrines and temples and castles all over the region. So yeah, it was cool.
And what does the Air Force have up there?
So that's the 35th Fighter Wing stationed at Misawa. There's 2 squadrons of F-16s, probably about 30,000 people on the base.
Oh my God.
And their primary mission at Misawa is they're the first ones in if things go off in Korea, between North and South Korea. So our job as the cops on base, we had a deployment tasking. If the war starts in Korea, if the apocalypse begins, we were one of the first teams to go in and hold the base while they evacuate civilians and start the war fighting capabilities. So we had a really serious mission at Japan. We were constantly doing combat training, base defense training. We spent a lot of time in Korea doing training with the Korean forces and U.S. Army. So yeah, it was a combat mission there. 35th Fighter Wing.
Okay, so you're in that region initially, and then where does your career take you from there?
Yeah.
And then again, this is 93, right? Just to establish time. Okay.
93, I got there at the end of 93. And then I spent the first couple of years just learning the job, doing security. We had a big intelligence squadron at Misawa too, so a joint intel with Army, Navy, Marines, the whole works. We guarded that. We had a deep space tracking site, the 3rd deep space tracking site that tracked objects in orbit. I guarded that. That was my first encounter with the anomalous at that site. I could talk about that.
Yeah, let's do that right now. I mean, since we're going chronologically.
Yeah, so this would have been in that late 93 or sometime in 94 time frame. I was a security guard at the 3rd space tracking site on the interior security patrol that night.
And by the way, where was this again? What part of this is also in Japan?
So this was Misawa Air Force Base, Japan.
Okay.
Northern part of Japan. It's situated right on the coast. So yeah, we were on duty. I was on the internal security patrol with another person. And we had taken a break. We came up to the entry control point. It's a big armored building that allows, access in and out of the site. And the site is this enormous multi-acre fenced-in area with radomes. Radomes are big, like golf ball looking things with antennas and satellites in them. So we had a radome field and then a large complex, top secret facility. and I guarded the exterior. So I had come up to the entry control point. We were all in the back having a smoke and talking. And there were 3 of us, maybe 4. And we were looking into the area and just talking. And we saw a orb of light about the size of a basketball just appear low to the ground. And then it just arced in like a rainbow. And it, right before it hit the ground, it just vanished. So it just appeared and then whoop and vanished.
What color was it?
It was a blue color.
Okay.
And it was about 50 feet away. There was no obstructions. It was basically like looking through a parking lot. It's like, there it is. And whoop.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So we all looked at each other and I'm like, my God, did you guys see that? And they're like, yeah, what was it? And we talked for a minute and then I called it in over the radio. And I said something like, be advised, we just had a strange light in the area. And I said it might have been a flare because my brain was kind of trying to rationalize what had happened. And I remember as soon as I said it might be a flare, my brain was like, that was not a flare. You saw it appear right there, arc and vanish right there. And then that triggered a response. We went on alert. People responded to the area. We swept the area, checked all the doors, made sure there was nobody inside. And my boss came out and debriefed me. And we had to write statements. This is what we saw and all the details. And that was reported. It was put in the blotter. The blotter is our chronological record of everything that happens on a shift. And we wrote the statements and talked to the boss. And he's like, okay, if you see anything else weird, let us know. And we just went back to work. So that was the first real, like, anomalous, strange thing I'd seen on duty.
Did you get a sense that this was the first time anybody saw something strange at this place? Or was your commander kind of blasé, like, oh, okay, here's another one?
No, Japan and Vandenberg was the same. When I showed up to Japan and Vandenberg, you start meeting people, you go to parties and you're drinking and talking and socializing, and people start to tell you ghost stories. That's a pretty common theme throughout my military career. I've actually got a really good friend he might be still working on a book about all the ghost stories, high strangeness and weirdness that we encounter, on these different bases. So there was already a lot of ghost stories. Matter of fact, I was just having Thanksgiving with 2 of my buddies from Japan that they're my oldest and best friends. We spent a lot of night talking about these ghost stories, some that they had seen and other ones that had happened while we were on duty. So there was always that baseline, like, strangeness going on. And then you would see something like that and you're like, okay, what is going on? What is it? Is it a ghost? Is it some kind of atmospheric effect? And you just don't know.
Okay, so you report this in, then you go to your next duty station.
Yeah, so I was in Japan for almost 7 years. And then I got orders to Vandenberg, U.S. Space Command. So I went there.
And then just for folks who fell off the turnip truck, where roughly is Vandenberg? What are its primary missions, and why might it be an area of interest for anybody, particularly, not just UAPs, but near peer competitors like Russia, China? Like, why is that an interesting place?
Yeah, so Vandenberg is located on the central coast of California. It's about an hour, maybe an hour and a half north of Santa Barbara. And it's situated right on the coast. It's a gigantic installation. It's like 36 miles of coastline and over 100,000 like square acres of land. So just this huge tract of land right on the coast. Nothing really out there other than the base. So kind of a pristine wilderness. There's mountains and some flat coastline and then the coast. And its primary function is to develop, build, and launch space launch assets. So they had clean rooms where they could develop top level, like high technology satellite systems. They could actually build them, move them to the payload, and launch them. Also, at that time, I got there in 1999 is when I got there. And then, the September 11th had happened 2001. And right after that, we got a brand new mission. We were going to be the primary test facility for the National Missile Defense Project. And that was President Bush's new initiative.
That's like the THAAD system, like Theater High Altitude Air Defense stuff.
Yeah, it was like a
system.
Star Wars system. They were going to try to revamp everything, use new tech, and it was designed to shoot down anything coming from space into the U.S. So top cutting technology. And that became really our focus after the war started. They were building out and refurbishing all these older launch facilities that were scattered about the base that had been decommissioned, like probably in the 70s. So they were building out all new infrastructure, and we were launching rockets and testing the interceptors and all of that. So that was the main thing. We did some really, really important national missile defense launches that I worked on. Some, that they said were the most important launches in 25 years. So you're talking missions that have the highest level of scrutiny from the executive branch. Like some of these launches, the president would be watching in Washington via satellite link. And then after we would do a launch, we would get a call from the president, like in the command center, and he'd say, good job, guys. So it was a big deal, a lot of attention. And we had some real world threats. We had people they would try to infiltrate the base. They'd try to disrupt the launch or so I dealt with all of that.
Were these people generally peer competitor folks, like Chinese, Russian agents, or were there some like terrorist types?
It fell into the realm of activists that wanted to peacefully disrupt the launch, so they would just get into the launch area. Or we had terrorism threats for people that were going to come in and try to blow up the rocket on the pad or shoot it down while it was in flight. And some of those threats were deadly serious. So a lot of what I did and my friends, we would go out on teams in the mountains and we would track these people down and apprehend them.
Now, in any of these missions, without going into any detail, did any of these launches have nuclear payloads? And that could mean either power sources, right? Or it could like a nuclear generator or a power plant of some sort, or like weapons.
Yeah, not to my knowledge, and we would have known about that because me and in my career field, that's what we do. If there are nuclear materials, we are responsible for guarding them. So if there were, it's likely that I would know about it, but no, this was generally traditional tech.
What about on the post? Were there any nuclear materials that you know of?
I think they decommissioned all the nukes in the 70s there. So it was non-nuclear facilities.
Did they ever test like ICBMs there? Well, obviously without nuclear warheads, but
probably some of the launches we did, it was something similar to an ICBM, and then we would try to shoot it down, or an ICBM type of weapon system would be launched from, let's say, Florida, and then we would try to intercept. Yeah, but we had the capability to launch almost anything there. As a matter of fact, the main launch facility is what SpaceX uses now. So they came in that was happening while I was there. They were talking about civilian company coming in and contracting out the launch pads. So yeah, they can put the biggest rockets we have up into space from Vandenberg.
Okay, so you report there in 1999, and your unit security, is that you guys wear blue berets? Is that accurate?
We're the blue berets, yeah.
Okay. Now, you're there in 1999. What happens is there anything between then and 2003 that's worth talking about before we get into the incident?
They're mostly incidents of extreme high strangeness leading up to it.
Let's go through. Well, I guess let's not do too many of them, but
yeah.
Well, let me ask you a framing question, because I want to make sure that we save a lot of this for the second episode. The high strangeness, was there more high strangeness after the event than before the event, or was it about the same?
It's hard to tell. I'd probably say about the same. Well, I could just go into detail about some of the things, the more ephemeral type things, but Vandenberg is extremely foggy because it's a peninsula that kind of juts out into the Pacific. So every day, like around 3 p.m., you get what's called the marine layer that comes in. You get this just thick blanket of fog. Visibility is like zero. So you have this spooky kind of atmosphere anyway, where it's always foggy and it's strange and spooky. But the things I was hearing early when I got there were about you'd be out at night working a shift and you would hear drumming. You'd hear like Native American drumming and chanting in the fog. You would see strange lights on the perimeter. You would see people that shouldn't be, in an empty building. Patrol would be walking through and they'd see somebody cut across the hall. And then they would run around looking for people. So there was a lot of stories like that when I got there. And then other stories of they're not like supernatural, but like sort of law enforcement type stories. And I could tell you one of them if you want. That was like, I'm like, this is so out there, it can't be real. But then later it ended up being real. And I'm like, okay, So yeah, I guess we could talk about, but there was this general aura of spookiness at the base. And that was true for Misawa too. Lots of ghost stories, lots of poltergeist type activity, weird phone calls that would come in on the 911 line, just all kind of weirdness. And that's kind of, I guess, how I got involved in this from a young age. I used to keep records of all that. Like if something weird happened on shift and we got like a 911 call that ended up with a disembodied voice asking for help. And then we would go to the house and, the phone is not connected and the house is abandoned, but these calls. So I would keep records of those. I'd go at the end of the shift, be like, hey, give me the blotter page from that weird call. So I started building a file, my X file, from a very young age. So I had all these records about this weirdness.
Now, given the close proximity, this is a question for the skeptics. Given the close proximity to the Pacific Ocean, right? Like the crash of the waves, things like that, produce a lot of infrasonics, right? And infrasonics have been correlated to hallucinations, things like that, where people report paranormal things, hearing sounds, things like that. I think the best example of this is in Big Sur. Are you familiar with Big Sur and
I've been there.
What are they called? They're like no, I can't remember. There's like these shadow people type things. They're like 10 feet tall that people report seeing on the mountains there. It was reported in some of Steinbeck's work, I think The Red Pony, where he wrote about it. But there's like an effect, like there's these apparitions there where I'm not saying they're not apparitions. They very well could be. They could also be the impact of all the infrasonics. So is that something that anyone looked into? I doubt it, but I'd be curious if that.
As far as I know, in an official manner, in a scientific manner, but me and my friends and coworkers were constantly trying to figure out analytically, like, what is causing the phenomenon? And we would look at things like that, like there was, geological activity, the wind. We would try to go through these when the events would happen, especially like with the weird phone calls we would get.
Yeah, that's an electronic. Well,
Yeah,
I guess it could
yeah,
it could be electronic. It could be auditory. You don't really. Yeah.
right. So a lot of those things, they just happen, and you're like, that was weird. We can't really explain it, but there's a plausible explanation. So you just kind of move on. And then over time, they pile up, and then you have some that maybe we could talk about later.
Yeah. We'll
And I
talk
can
about that later.
even possibly put you into contact with the people that witness these really bizarre events where there's just no explanation. And it happens in a public setting where it's being called in over the radio. These supernatural, strange events are triggering an armed response, right? And it's happening in real time, and people are calling it in over the net. And then at the end of those things, we're all standing around saying, what happened? It's too weird to be real, but it did happen, right? So we were constantly in a state of seeing the impossible become possible. And then it all comes to a head with the incident, like with the Vandenberg UAP incursions. And then you're just, what is going on now? Like, it's just a different level.
All right, well, let's go to that point. Describe kind of how you got involved, what you were doing, like what day, time, all that stuff.
So yeah, at the time, this was October 2003, October 14th. I was assigned to Bravo flight. So every police unit's made up of 4 flights. A flight is like a platoon. So we had 65, maybe 120 people on each flight, depending. So I was assigned to Bravo flight. At the time, I was the senior patrolman on a flight, so I was sort of in a leadership position. I was in charge of all the patrolmen and our gate guards. So I had about 20 people working for me on the flight. Then I reported to the flight chief, who was a senior.
So patrolman, I'm reading into this. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like there would be somebody who would be like roving guards, like just kind of patrolling the perimeters and checking. Okay.
So yeah, I could briefly what I did. So Vandenberg, I did a lot of training and a lot of work on duty with like California Highway Patrol, Santa Barbara County Sheriff, because the base was big and we had joint jurisdiction on some of the highways and we had proprietary jurisdiction on some of the roadways. So like if there was a wreck or a DUI or a human trafficking incident, we would respond and work together with the local police. So it was traditional law enforcement, very robust. That area is a major drug route, human trafficking route. So everything good and bad going north, south in California may make its way through that region. So yeah, we had a very robust law enforcement mission, and that's what I did. And then we had our security side, which they dealt with securing the base and all the different resources we had. So on that time, I had come in on October 14th. I came in, we were working the night shift. Delta flight was working the day shift. I came in about an hour early to work to do changeover with the offgoing Delta flight leadership. And when I pulled up, there was a crowd of people at the smoke pit across from our armory. And I could tell that something had happened, because when I drove by, they all started to point like, oh, there's Jeff. I can't wait to tell him. And that wasn't really unusual because we had, a lot of law enforcement activity. So a lot of times I'd come on duty and they'd be like, dude, you'll never believe what happened on the highway type thing.
Right.
So I get out of my truck and I come over, and everybody, there's probably about a dozen, maybe fewer people, all guys I know from Delta flight, or guys coming in on my shift, or people that work in the staff. And they all start to tell me all at once that they had this real world UFO encounter at 08:45 that morning. And the short story was that there were 3 Boeing contractors working on launch facility 21 and 10, 2 launch pads on the north end of the base. And they were doing maintenance on the National Missile Defense Project. This was one of the sites with the interceptors. And they had called in and said there was a gigantic red floating square at low altitude over the launch pad making no noise. And they had observed it for a period of time, I think maybe 5 to 10 minutes. And then eventually, these three guys were just staring at it, and they picked up the phone and they called their command center, their range control.
What were the dimensions of this thing? And was it a solid black square? Was it dark, light, glowing?
So from what the documents I have, we know it's larger than 20 feet.
When you say larger than 20 feet, you mean one of its edges is more than 20 feet?
So not a lot of details.
Okay.
Because I've since lost the primary witness, his detailed statement. So I have secondary records. I have the blotter entry describing vaguely what they saw, and one witness statement describing vaguely what was seen. But what
happened to the original statement?
That's all story. So I could tell that briefly.
Yeah.
So in 2011, 2012, I was running my own company in New Jersey. I had a retail and event store. And some of the customers had been talking about this subject. And I started to tell them some of my crazy stories from the military. And I told them, I said, yeah, I had a real world UFO event, and we were talking about it. And some people were like, it's BS. And other people believed it. So I told them, I'll bring in the paperwork from home tomorrow, come in and I'll show you. And I did that. So they came in, I'm like, here, read all this stuff. And they were like, oh my God, this is real. And I'm like, yeah, this is real. This happened. And then I took all that paperwork, I boxed it back up, and I took it to the bottom of my store into the basement. And I had racks and shelves so I could store everything. So I put it up there, got busy, forgot about it. And some time went by, and then we had a flood. And basically a sewer pipe that ran the length of my store burst right over that box and all my other stuff and flooded the basement with 3.5 feet of sewer water.
And what proximity between when you showed this stuff to these people?
It was probably within a couple of months. And that was the thing, I'm still kicking myself.
That was not an accident.
Because
it would have taken about that long for word to get out that happened. And then, did anybody else have access to the basement?
No, just my employees, but I think it was just act of God. Because that day, I mean, it was just, what happened was right in front of the store, there's a water drain, and it's an intersection, four-way intersection, and it had jammed with trash. And the whole street was flooding, and it was putting pressure on that pipe in the joint. And it wouldn't have happened if these knucklehead, the landlord brought his plumbers over, and they opened, and I tried to talk them out of it. I'm like, dude, there's too much pressure. Like, I would just let the pressure go down, and they cracked that cap, and it just geysered out. And then they couldn't get it back on. It was unbelievable.
Okay. All right. So it was destroyed in this flood or this sewage. Yeah.
But luckily, I think within a couple of weeks after that, I was completely devastated, man, because it was all of my stuff. A lot of my military records, some of my performance reports, medals, and deployment paperwork and VA paperwork, and my UFO stuff. So I was just like completely devastated and just angry with myself. But then I was going through some other VA paperwork at home, and I found some of the records that had gotten mixed in between boxes. And I was like, good, I've got the blotter entry that shows it happened, and I have one handwritten, sworn statement about it happening. So I'm saved. I have some evidence, not the whole file. And that's what I've been able to give to Congress and Aero and the government. So they've got some evidence.
Okay, back to the incident. These 3 Boeing employees are staring at this red cube that's hovering 20 feet over the launch pad?
Probably like 50 to 100 or possibly 200 feet above. So very low altitude right over the pad.
All right, like 2/3 of a football field, something like that.
Yeah, and the object they described, the initial witness described, I remember quite distinctly from his statement that it was larger than a football field.
And then what, was there a sound?
No sound. Absolutely silent. Glowing, a red color. Square.
Solid?
A solid object. Yeah.
What were these Boeing engineers doing that day?
So they were doing maintenance on the launch facility, whatever that means. They were working on.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So continue. So this thing's hovering, then what?
Yeah. So I get this briefing and then I walk to the command center and then I meet the flight chief and their senior patrolman, my counterpart. And they tell me they actually responded out there when they got the initial call and they interviewed these contractors and they took their sworn written statements. Now, these two patrolmen didn't see any objects on their way out or way back. The thing had floated onto the installation. So where they observed it, they're right on the coast. And then after they called it in, it gently floated onto the installation. So it went east, deeper onto the base and disappeared over the hills. They lost sight. So my buddies responded out there, contacted them, got the story, wrote everything down, came back, typed up a report, made all the notifications. So, and I have that document, the blotter entry names the three witnesses, where they work, who they are. It gives us a brief synopsis of what they saw and who they contacted, and then the after actions, and then lists everyone in the chain of command that was notified. So that's important. So we know my commander, the chief of police was notified, OSI, the command post, and on and on. So we have a record of all that. But that's basically what happened that morning. They saw this weird thing. It floated onto the base. They called it in. Their range control called weather to see if it was a balloon. They called the tower to check radar. They called various other command and control centers to see if anybody knew what it was. And
did it show up on radar?
It did not. So there was no radar tracks, nothing in the sky, no helicopters flying, no balloons, nothing from the Coast Guard. So it was anomalous. So I got that briefing and I made copies of all the paperwork as they were telling me. I'm getting I've got 5 people telling me, oh my God, telling me this crazy story. And some of them, I remember the main flight chief that I was talking to, he was just kind of blowing it off. He didn't really want to talk about it. He didn't want to speculate. He was just like, I don't know. And he would just kind of wander off. And then other people were like me. They were like, let's talk about it. What is it? What do you think it is? They were excited. And then some people were kind of freaked out. They were like, I don't know what it is. I'm going to stay in. They didn't want to be outside. But the general environment was everybody was excited because they knew this was real. It wasn't a prank. It had been briefed up the chain. And then we came on duty. So yeah, we came on duty. I went and got night vision. I got a thermal imager. I got some binocs. And me and my buddies went out that day looking for UFOs. So we came on shift around 6 p.m.
Wait, was this part of an official mission or was this just curiosity?
This was just us on duty, and we're going to go out and have fun looking for UFOs.
Okay.
And doing our regular job. But that was the primary focus for me. It's like, if they're out here, I want to see, So yeah. And then we came on duty. And then sometime in the evening or late, my one buddy that's a witness thinks it happened around 1 a.m. So we'd been on duty for quite some time. And I had been out on the ocean on the coast looking at the sky with my, with these NVGs and stuff, looking for them. And at some point, I remember feeling like I got spooked out. I'm like, I'm out here alone. I'm 15 or 20 minutes from main base. And if they show up, what's going to happen? I'm alone, and I got a little freaked out. So I jumped in my car and I went back to the command center. I got there. My buddies were running the command center and we were chatting about this whole thing. Like, what's going on with the UFOs, And not long after I was there, we got a radio transmission from Slick 4, which is Space Launch Facility 4, located on the opposite end of the base, on the south end. And they said something to the effect of, be advised, we have a weird light moving erratically out over the Western Ocean. So the controller, they have a conversation, keep an eye on it, keep a visual on it, let us know if anything happens. And then we had some other security patrols in that vicinity, like, yeah, I see a light too. I see a light too. I can't see it. So there's data coming in. So I'm thinking, okay, I better head that way. So I get up, I start grabbing my gear, and then all hell breaks loose. And the security patrol at Slick 4 calls in. They're like, hey, this thing is getting bigger. It's getting brighter. It's moving very strangely, not like an aircraft. And it looks like it's coming towards the base. So now I'm like, okay, time to go. I'm in my car. I'm driving. Everybody else is chiming in over the radio. And then really all hell breaks loose. And these guys start screaming and yelling. It's coming right for us. It's coming right at us. And now it's right here. And in the meantime, it's dark. I'm driving code 3 as fast as I can with my head out the window, looking, listening to all the radio traffic. People are freaking out. People are calling in all kind of different things, different lights. And then I distinctly remember like a lull in the radio traffic and then them saying, okay, it's shot off. It's gone. And I'm like, okay. So I get to Slick 4. Everybody's waiting for me outside. And basically what had happened was when the initial person called in the light, the strange light, everybody kind of rallied to the entry control point to talk to, like, what's going on? What do you see? So there were 6 people outside observing it when it happened. And that's what they said. It was fluttering, moving oddly, like not like any aircraft you've ever seen. It just these weird, abrupt movements, like no pattern. And the light was multicolored, changing, hard to kind of define, but all they could see was a light. But as it approached, it got really big and bright. And then when it got really close, the light went out and it just went dark. And then they saw it hovering like 200 feet above them. It was enormous. And it was just this big, black, matte, sort of square, maybe rectangular object. Just this, like a building just floating over you. And they were all together, standing there with their guns, staring up at it, like in complete awe. And it was there for about 45 seconds. And then it just shot off. And they were just left looking at each other like, oh my God, what happened? And they called that in. So I talked to everybody in the group, then I separated everybody. I took all kind of notes and I had every one of them write a statement, sign and swear that that's the truth. And my boss came out, same thing. He had a conversation. We talked it all out. Then I went around after that and I went to the various other patrolmen in that region and said, what did you see? I didn't see nothing. We heard this. So I had notes on all that. Who saw what? And then eventually I got back to the command center. We typed up everything and it was all up channeled to higher headquarters. Like, here's the incident. We've had 2 and it was reported up the chain. And then the rest of the night was a normal night. It's weird. Like, this stuff happens, you do what you can, and then it's over. And you're like, what do we do now, man? Like, what? And it's like, I don't know, go back to work. Like, you have building checks to do, and there's a drunk on the highway in a ditch, and, life goes back to normal like that. So, yeah, that was the second event in October.
Did you get any attention from the Air Force Office, a special investigation at any point?
Not at that time. At that time, it was all sort of handled in-house. I know they were notified, so they were aware of it. I don't know what OSI was doing on the back end. So I assumed they had already debriefed the contractors and maybe some of the cops that had responded that morning, but I don't know for sure. But we didn't have any that I recall, and it's been over 20 years. So it might have been OSI came out and chatted with us. I don't remember. But we didn't have any kind of serious debriefing until later, until the third event happened a few days later.
Okay, so the third event.
So this is when things got really weird. So we know that this event happened sometime before October 14th and October 31st because the eyewitness deployed to Iraq on October 31st. So, and I was his direct supervisor. He was my troop. He was one of my law enforcement guys, and he was also one of our desk sergeants, a controller, command center controller. So he was one of my sharpest guys. So in this time frame, sometime between the 14th and the end of the month, this individual was stationed on a security patrol near the flight line with another person, two-person patrol. And same thing, we're working a night shift. They spot a strange light over the Western Ocean again. It's weird. The light looks weird. It's not flashing like an aircraft, and the thing's fluttering around, making these weird maneuvers. They call it in. The command center advises everybody to go on alert, keep an eye out. They observe it, start to approach the base and drop in elevation. Like it looks like an aircraft coming in to land on the flight line. Now, we know that this was abnormal because the flight line was shut down for the evening. There was no one on duty. There were no planes inbound, no helicopters inbound or outbound. And the cops know about all that. So we're in charge of knowing what's on the flight line, where aircraft are parked, what aircraft are inbound and outbound. So we have that data. This night, nothing was happening. Flight line is shut down. The running lights are off. It's just a ghost town. Then they observe this thing looked like it's going to come in and land on the base. So they call it in. It gets announced as an unannounced aircraft arrival, which is one of the most serious security incidents you can have on a base. You cannot have unknowns landing or approaching your airbase, right?
Right.
And we get those sometimes. I've worked on a number of unannounced aircraft arrivals, and sometimes it's somebody in a Cessna having trouble. They need an alternate land. Sometimes they're lost. They think they're landing on an airport and they're not. Sometimes it's a defector. It's somebody coming in from, overseas and they're going to defect. So there's reasons for that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But when it does happen, we respond in force to mitigate the threat, right? So we do that. And before the patrolman can get to the flight line, my buddy and his friend observe it come in low. All they can see is a light. They can't make out any kind of structure, just this strange, bright, intense light. It drops below the tree line. So there's a tree line between them and the flight line. So this object comes behind the tree line. So you're talking lower than 50 or 30 feet. And it appeared to either land or hover just above the flight line. And then my buddy Grant that saw it said, as soon as it was there, it was gone. It just came in gently and sort of landed, was there for a moment, and then shot off like a star and vanished into the atmosphere, like in a second. And then he called that in. Everybody responds. They set up the perimeter. The thing is gone. And then we have another like enigma. Like, where is it? What was it? How do we report this? What's going on? Now, while that incident was still being investigated, an Air Force colonel, full bird colonel, came out to my buddy. He was still on duty, on his post, and talked to him and the other witness. It was sort of like an impromptu, unofficial debriefing. And We're not sure who this colonel worked for or what he was doing, but he was aware of the situation. He was there to find out from the direct witnesses what they saw. And they couldn't.
He didn't identify himself. He didn't identify what.
They don't remember. It was like, hey, I'm Colonel whoever. I'm out here to talk to you guys about what you saw.
But he didn't say which organization he represented or anything like that.
He might have, but they don't remember. They don't remember.
Okay.
But they just remember the rank. And they didn't have a lot to tell him. You know, they're like, we don't know what it was. It was just this bright light. And then they could describe how it fluttered. They could describe the colors and the speed, but no other, like, they couldn't give any description of what they saw other than this light.
Oh, Jeff, it's just a conventional drone. Nothing to see here.
Balloon, maybe sure. So
I say in jest, yeah.
But then sometime after that, we're not sure. And I don't believe I was on duty for this incident. I think they had my troop working on another flight because of manpower issues, and he was deploying. But I remember hearing about it. And then the next day, or maybe the following day, he was called in and debriefed. And this is when things got very difficult for him. When he was called in, he was made to feel as if he had done something wrong, had seen something he shouldn't, and that he might be in trouble, and that he needs to keep his mouth shut. And then he was made to write a statement, and he was also forced to sign a document, but he does not remember exactly what that is, whether that was an NDA or some kind of other security document. He cannot remember. But he was so rattled, and like, this friend of mine, he's a tough dude. He's not an easily rattled kind of guy. He's a good old boy from Oklahoma that grew up on a ranch. He's not a timid human being by any, he's a tough guy. But he was so rattled after they talked to him, he drove directly to my house, knocked on my door, and came in and said, dude, we got to talk. They scared the living shit out of me. I'm in trouble. I don't know what to do. And him and I had a long conversation about what we should do from that point on. And it was basically like, we need to keep our mouths shut, stay quiet, be careful what we're reporting, because now we're getting in trouble for reporting things, right? So
what did they do to threaten him or intimidate him?
It was all verbal. It was just like the way that they conducted the interrogation made it sound like he had done something wrong. Like, you shouldn't have called that in. You shouldn't have made a big deal. You need to be discreet. And
how about go fuck yourself?
Exactly. And that's kind of his attitude. He's kind of
right.
Like, I'm just doing my job.
Yeah.
He's not easily intimidated. That's
if you don't want me to fucking report this shit, then let us know this shit exists.
Yeah.
Like, go fuck. Like, anyway, sorry, I'm just ranting, but
yeah, but they were able to shake him up. And that's what I mean. This is not a guy he's not a timid guy, at all. So
but they still did it in a way that, like, they made him feel like he had done something wrong, even though it's obvious he had clearly done nothing wrong whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, they can frame it around, and I don't know if this is the case, but they could frame it around like, hey, you pulled a prank and it's not funny. And then that could be scary for your career because, right? You're not reliable. You tell wild tales. You're making up.
Yeah, maybe we need to. Maybe you're Section 8. Maybe we need to check out your mental capability.
Yeah. And a lot of my friends, they were high performing people. So they had jobs that most cops don't have. They're involved in operations that most people aren't.
Well, did you have to get a TSSCI clearance for your role?
I did at certain points. Yeah.
Yeah. That's important. That's not like every MP doesn't get a TSSCI clearance in the Army.
Right. And being selected for all the cool missions, right? You want to go out and do important things. And if you're not reliable and you're the kind of person running your mouth about weird lights at night, you're not going to be on that mission. You'll be standing on an aircraft in the freezing rain. So this is how they can apply pressure. Yeah. by just inferring that you're not being honest, or you're wasting people's time, or you don't know what the difference between a balloon and a bird and an aircraft, right?
Okay, so this is the first. And then was this the Air Force Office of Special Investigations?
We think so.
Yeah.
He can't say for 100% certain it was OSI, because OSI is plainclothes. And so are the FBI, and on and on and on, right? You're talking to some people in a suit. And sometimes they identify themselves and sometimes they don't. But pretty sure it was probably OSI.
Well, I'm surprised that, I don't. And the other thing too, he's probably young, things like that. Both of us were that age. We probably would have been kind of like, I mean, now it's like, who am I talking to?
Yeah.
You can't tell me? Well, how do I know you're not, Russian intelligence? How do I know?
Yeah.
Right? You can start playing those games, right? Where they have to show you some sort of identification. But, okay, so then what happens?
So those were the three main events that happened in October 2003. And then things kind of calmed down. And we would get reports of these strange lights here and there afterward, like, months and years after, but never anything as spectacular as those three events where they showed up. But, and this is the thing that I'm really trying to work hard to bring people out publicly, there were other incidents that happened at Vandenberg. So I had my own personal encounter that we could talk about. Another one that I can mention briefly that happened in around 2004 or 5. And this witness is the most credible witness that I know personally. It's a good friend of mine that I worked with. He was a top performer in the Air Force. He rose to the highest rank you can go, and he was involved in shaping security forces, policy, career, training. This guy went to the top. Good friend of mine. And in 94, 95, he's on patrol at Vandenberg at night, sitting in his patrol car, eating lunch or whatever, and he gets this weird feeling to get out of his car and look around. He's parked at like our flag circle, like in the middle of the base, just eating lunch. Gets out of the car, he looks up, and 50 feet over him is hovering a gigantic triangle, bigger than a C-130, according to him. Making no noise, with no lights, just floating right over his patrol car. And he just stood there again in awe, in shock. And then he just watched it slowly drift across the base until he lost sight of it. So I've got so many stories like that it's hard for me to tell them, because it sounds like I'm just making up things. And then this happened, and then a friend that, and then here, then in Korea, then in Japan, then in the Middle East. So that's the thing that many people like me and other military witnesses know. It's not one thing. It's happening all over to many different people. And we need to get that out, right?
Now, this one incident where there was a black triangle over your friend's car, did it do anything to the paint on the car or anything like that?
No, but it might have done something to him because he's ill.
Yeah,
And
I mean that makes sense.
Indeterminate illnesses where the doctors are like, we've never seen this before, but you're probably.
It's likely blue shift, like there are various theories about how anti-gravity works, right? Part of it is just compressing, in order, like your target is, you're compressing space-time in front of you, you're expanding space-time behind you. So I think as you're compressing space-time toward you, if one of these craft is moving toward you, it's fine. But if they're moving away from you, and that's basically what you would have to do if you're hovering, you would effectively have to expand space-time in order to stay steady. But what that does is that shifts all the, radiation upward. So, which results in, you could be getting a dose of ultra, like UV radiation. That's why people typically have like sunburn effects, because it blue shifts everything upward. So
Yeah, and that's what I'm really interested in, the medical side effects, because it's come out lately. And this is the thing, we don't know how reliable the data is. We need data, scientific data. But it's been reported that particularly the triangle craft have caused injury, right, to people on multiple occasions. Sometimes they emit beams of light, sometimes just close proximity. And we need to find out, because like this particular friend of mine, he was also, he ran a lot of operations during the war. He was exposed to, possibly radiation and chemicals and all kind of bad stuff while deployed. So we don't know. Like, we don't.
Yeah, I mean, he could have been around the burn pits, right?
Right. And so, we really need to look into this and get some real data. That's why the government needs to really cooperate. Like, these things are happening to our active duty military and civilians.
Yeah.
And what is the effect? Psychological, physical, everything. Like, what is going on when you have contact?
Yeah, I don't think our government is capable of doing it at this point. I mean, I think they've lost all credibility. It's up to people like us, right?
Yeah,
Full stop.
Citizen science is the way, for sure. We've got to
there's other stuff too that's hasn't quite made it into our science yet. I'm sure there's a scientific explanation for it, but I don't think we have the right physical models for some of this stuff just yet. Or we might. There might be some quantum mechanical things that we can tie it to, but I don't think because there's a metaphysical aspect to a lot of this stuff that this is a great segue for the next episode. So we're going to discuss some of that high strangeness that you were seeing next. So any final words for the audience before that?
Let's see. I mean, my main thing is encouraging people to come out with their stories, right? I think we have enough. The stigma's dropped a bit. It's still very powerful. And that's why we need military and civilian people to come out with their stories, because there's strength in numbers. So that's what's encouraging to me. You and I met at Seoul, and there are people involved in the community now that are doing real science. They're doing their own expeditions to record, these objects. They're looking into the medical effects, the psychological effects, the spiritual effects, and trying to figure out what the correlation is between all this high strangeness. Things that in my mind were always distinctly different, like ghosts and paranormal activity, and then UFOs. But the more we look into it, the more this is all blended together in some strange.
I actually have a weird question for you. You mentioned very briefly geology, right?
Yeah.
What's the geophysical aspects of Vandenberg? Is it shaped like a bowl or anything like that? Is there anything that's...
Well, it's on the subduction zone, basically, right? So you've got the continental shelf subducting under and rising it. You have these relatively new, high, steep mountain ranges there. And then you have earthquake activity at Vandenberg. So there's a lot going on geologically there.
Are there any negative magnetic anomalies? Anything like that?
I'm not sure, but there's definitely places where your radio, even if you have line of sight, we had radio problems there. You'd get all kind of weird interference and feedback. But I don't know about the magnetics. But yeah, there's a lot going on there. And then some of the phenomenon we can get into later, but it involved poles moving. And that was always my thing. It's is this an earthquake? Is this related to an earthquake? Or we have train tracks not far. And so a lot of weird things would happen, and we would try to come up with the prosaic explanation. Why are these things moving? Could be earthquake related. Could be trains. It could be the highway. It could be we were always trying to get down to a plausible explanation. But then there are things that we'll talk about soon that just blow that paradigm out of the water. You're like, I don't know what's going on.
All right. Well, Jeff, it was an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait for the next episode. So talk soon, brother.
All right.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.